Malcolm McLaren and the Bootsilla Orchestra's album Waltz Darling, and Madonna's single Justify My Love. However polarizing on the one hand, deeply off-kilter in relation to one another, these formed the brackets that, for me anyway, encapsulated the unwieldy era of the 80s. At the moment, it ostensibly shaded into the next decade. And every time I say the 80s, it's with brackets and quotes and all kinds of gestures towards being provisional. The two appeared just on either side of the 80s cusp proper. Waltz Darling in 1989. Many of you maybe don't know this album, but I'll give you a glimpse of it in a moment. The two appeared on just either side of the 80s cusp proper. Waltz Darling in 1989 and Justify My Love in late 1990. And for some, demarcated a line in the sand between, in the first case, a more authentic portrayal of one aspect of queer culture in distinct contrast to, in the second, an overt interloping and instrumentalization of it. Yet, for as different as was that glimpse of the New York gay underground scene being presented by the impresario of the Sex Pistols, from the one delivered by the queen of blonde ambition, both insisted, if from opposite ends of the spectrum, that a quite rarefied vernacular be introduced, virus-like, into a mass culture that was to some degree wholly unprepared to receive it. The more apparent comparison to McLaren's Waltz Darling, or at least the one much more often made, there was a lot of debate around this at the time, and most apparently in relationship to his single Deep in Vogue, is of course the more obviously contiguous Vogue, whose black and white video featured Madonna and her male, mostly non-white backup dancers, approximating a version of voguing inspired by, but also abstracted almost entirely away from its source. No wonder then that the biggest controversy surrounding Madonna's massive hit, the pop singer's first multi-platinum song, was whether MTV would demand to have masked the few glimpses to be had of her nipples peeking through a black lace shirt. They did not. Here's a clip from that video. Indeed, Madonna's depiction of voguing aligned it smoothly enough with ideas of old Hollywood glamour. Lauren, Catherine, Lana too, Betty Davis, We Love You. That scant references to the dance floor and phrases such as life's a ball were rendered more or less generic, no longer tethered to the Harlem scene, where perfected gestures and dancing marked overt instantiations of face-offs, turf wars, and an evolving community with all of its subsets. Madonna's abstraction of voguing didn't bother me at the time, and it doesn't really bother me now. I was as delighted with the double-dealing lyric Rita Hayworth gave good face as anyone else. Yet it does stand as a compelling example of what Judith Butler would point to in a larger context for her analysis of the film Paris is Burning, the celebrated but controversial 1991 documentary film directed by Jenny Livingston, detailing the lives of various New York City voguers and the context of the Harlem balls during the late 80s, as what she called drag as high-het entertainment, or perhaps even more to the point, quote, ritualistic release for a heterosexual economy that must constantly police its own boundaries against the invasion of queerness, end quote. Which is to say, of course, that however much Madonna has come over the years to stand as a gay icon, and indeed has no doubt contributed to one kind of visibility for the queer community, at the end of the 80s, Vogue served to re-ensconce as much as break down those heterosexist, to say nothing of racist and classist, norms it openly played with. If Madonna was somehow queered in Vogue, she was nonetheless doubly anointed as a larger-than-life straight white woman. If her dancers were clearly enough marked as other, African-American, Latino, effeminate, they were asked to bend twice to serve up their supporting roles. This pop version of voguing, then, entered the mainstream without ruffling its feathers, able, as Butler would have it, to both, quote, produce and contain homosexual excess, unquote. Not quite so with Justify My Love. This is the video which was actually banned by MTV, the first video to be banned by MTV, ostensibly for its explicit nature, and it was only available then on VHS, the first time a music video was packaged and sold in this manner, with this big parental advisory on it. Yet, as Madonna and others pointed out, the singer explicitly in an interview on Nightline shortly after the scandal broke, there was clearly more at stake than the brief nudity and suggestions of sex contained therein. Male vocal artists had presented much racier material in both their lyrics and videos, without question, or the kind of public tumult that accompanied Justify My Love. In Madonna's own view, the stir, which she appeared to enjoy and profited greatly from, with the single staying at the top of the charts for weeks, had everything to do with gender, her own, at a moment when female sexuality was usually neither hyperbolized nor represented as aggressive or primary. But while the singer's assessment of the situation is sound enough, it's also, in my view, partial. For while I wouldn't want to make too much of the subversive potential of Justify My Love, which was, at the end of the day, a tad titillating, but also fairly light and even a bit cheesy, as you'll see in a moment, it is nonetheless a closer cousin to McLaren's Waltz, if only for the way that ambiguity gets used as a device to unmoor sexuality, and maybe more to the point, gender, to set them afloat and let them land with a whiff of haphazardness. I'm going to show you a clip of this too, which is weirdly, I realized as I picked it, like the scene before, pretty much performed for the heterosexual male, but you'll see what I mean. 20 years ago, this was really racy stuff. I don't know how it looks now, but in the end, the raciest aspect of the video for Justify My Love is a tepid trespass into sadomasochism, as you saw a bare-chested woman wearing a bit of leather and elsewhere tapping a riding crop, and bisexuality. Madonna makes out sort of with another woman who's in playful drag, her hair slicked back and a mustache penciled on. It still manages, I would argue, or at least managed at the time, to somehow exceed the parameters of high-het entertainment. This is not because there is in the end much homosexual excess to be found. Madonna's fantasy forays are framed here firmly to be just that. It's a dream sequence, and she walks away from it. But there is nevertheless some overturning or denaturing of a strict sexual economy, even if only gestured to. Perhaps it's simply that in Butler's examples of high-het entertainment, Tootsie, say, or Victor Victoria, aberrant sexual impulses are dealt with as the stuff of humor or parody, where in Justify My Love there is, for better or worse, something of the serious allotted to Desire's wanderings. But this was never meant to be a talk about Madonna. Enough ink has been spilled about her place in visual culture for me to call my own case study here quits. Indeed, this is an inquiry meant to plumb the question of what I'll call the tectonics of identity, just as the various plates of gender and sexuality showed themselves to be more mobile, less stable than they had previously been portrayed. Indeed, if mine is a brief exploration into the 80s, it is more a speculation on a set of terms that begin to enumerate and expand a threshold, a concept to which I will return than any chronology or zeitgeist diagnosis. And here I just want to pause and say, one aim of my work on the 80s is to trouble the idea of a cleanly demarcated decade and to highlight that this decade and any decade, moments simultaneous, if contradictory, ideological, and cultural strata should always be considered. The impulse against a cohesive view of the 80s is put forward compellingly by Rosalind Deutsch in the context of a published roundtable, who argues that we should approach the period, quote, not as a literal decade, but as a formation of ideas and practices that transgresses chronological boundaries. And that's the end of that quote. If I open with a meditation on the figure of Madonna, it is only to suggest something of this hard-to-define situation was being negotiated very much out in the open. Its effects felt not only in subcultural spheres, but in fact in culture at large. And this, not inconsequentially, occurring at the same moment as massive funding cutbacks and overtly politically driven censorship in the arts, including the famous cases of Robert Mapplethorpe, Andre Serrano, and Holly Hughes, among others. And again, a side note, the topic of arts funding in the NEA in the 1980s and early 1990s, Ronald Reagan's attempt to dismantle the whole after his election, and the later strategic censorship by the far right of a great deal of artistic production on out-and-out moral grounds, has been covered extensively, although to place it too readily in the rearview mirror grants our current situation a more liberated status than it actually has. As I've been writing this essay, as many of you know, the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. removed a work by David Wojnarowicz from the exhibition Hide and Seek, Difference in Desire in American Portraiture, on the basis, and very openly, that some viewers felt the work by a well-known, deceased, openly gay artist to be anti-Christian. So we're not out of the woods. It is striking, then, to return to Butler, who in 1989 was articulating a new endeavor for feminist theory, or rather, a new question about its historical and then currently presumed aims, asking, quote, whether feminist politics could do without a subject in the category of women, end quote. Framed within the structure of her tremendously influential book, Gender Trouble, which probably most of you have seen the re-released edition, which is not hot pink, but a kind of much nicer or a more neutral patina. Within this book is a continual insistence that for feminism to extract itself from the endgame of identity politics, subjectivity itself must be rethought as a perpetual process, rather than either state or embodiment. While not wholly defined by our actions, Butler argues, we are nonetheless constituted by them, though we simultaneously define the scope and symbolism of those very actions through our performance of them. I'm sure most of you are very aware of Butler's argument in this book, but it's interesting to think about the context in which she was arguing. One of the earliest thinkers to articulate the political promise of the performative, Butler here suggests that as subjects, we are necessarily both bound to and able to change the parameters of our very contours in the discursive social world. She says, quote, the culturally admired subject negotiates its constructions even when those constructions are the very predicates of its own identity. Key to this negotiation and central to the constructions of identity are sex and gender. Without losing a number of mandates key to legacies of feminism, Butler does, however, want to pry loose the prevalent, and I would say still today, idea that feminism agrees on its subject, a subject defined unproblematically as woman. Yet Butler points out such ostensible agreements only serve to buoy up the idea that there is some essential, perpetually existing identity to which that word corresponds. Rather than ask that we do away with our identifications as such, Butler suggests that recognizing the flux of both those phantasmatic positions and our relationships to them, via approximation and failure, pleasure and alienation, redefines the very concepts by which we identify ourselves and are identified, and through which we align ourselves politically, amorously, emotionally, familially, and intellectually.